All right, John Parisella, thank you so much for doing this. I have to say you are an absolute gentleman for accepting this. I really appreciate you, and I'm grateful for the time that you're giving. We've been trying to make this work from the beginning of the year,
That's right.
but unfortunately, there were some circumstances that we all had to kind of adjust to. Uh, how's this period been for you? I mean, how have you been coping throughout this?
Well, I've stayed very busy. I'm at an age where a lot of my contemporaries have either retired, I hate to say this, some of them have, there's at least three of them that I lost in the course of the year. So that doesn't make you feel eternal, that's for sure. So, but I stayed busy. I work, I do a lot of remote work. I've been doing a lot of conferences, did over 30 conferences between September and now on US politics and the impact this could have on Canada. Secondly, I've been doing some consulting, not a lot, but a bit to. I'd say the equivalent of a full day, so it's spread over a couple. Thirdly, I've been doing teaching. I teach at the University of Montreal. I'm part of one of their master's programs, and I do some training at Global Affairs for potential diplomats or potential public servants who are in place in Ottawa but are planning to go to the United States.
Right.
So since I was Delegate General in New York and was responsible for the Washington office, I can bring something to the table, and then the rest is basically writing a few articles, doing some media work depending on the situation. When they reminisce, it's on this year was Oka, the 30th anniversary of Oka, the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Beach Lake Accord, and then of course we had people like Claude Castonguay who passed away that I was asked to comment on. But overall, it's been a busy year, in some ways productive and busier than maybe the last two or three before. So I actually adjusted to remote work, to the virtual work. And I'm actually quite pleased to do this with you because I think the workplace is going to be going through some transformations.
Right.
I don't think we're going to go back to where we were before. On the other hand, I don't think we're going to completely be in a world whereby what we did before we won't do again. So I think a hybrid formula where people will work from home a bit more as they got to be closer to their children. I think they realize that if their children have to be careful about class sizes and stuff like that because of COVID over the next year or two. Hopefully it won't be two, but it could be. I mean, like it or not, we didn't expect to be in this. I mean, a year ago, the first cases in Wuhan took place, and we didn't know. Nobody knew.
Yeah, exactly.
And then in January, we heard about it, heard the politicians say a few words, but nobody took it seriously. And so, I remember I took my last train ride on Via from Ottawa on, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was March 10th or 11th, and I had somebody actually sitting close to me, next to me, and obviously, over the next 14 days, when the confinement started, I called my doctor and he says, look, stay home. Don't go out. Don't do anything with anybody in particular, except stay home with your wife and just see if there's any symptoms. And so I got through that. And but it gives you, we adjusted. I mean, adapting and adjusting was probably the biggest challenge this year.
For sure. And it's going to be challenging, especially for for people like us who have worked so much with people, right? I mean, we get it's fuel for us, right? I mean, there's so much energy that we need, to do this kind of work, and suddenly you're asked to not talk to people, not meet people, I mean, not go out where people are at, and it's difficult. I mean, I was listening to you. I'm hearing you saying that perhaps the workplace is going to change, and for sure, I mean, eventually, we're going to have to transition and evolve, and if this is the new technologies of the future, then everyone's pretty much going to adopt them. But at the same time, it feels like you need that human touch, right? I mean, there's certain fields and there's certain jobs out there that if you don't have this, it kind of makes you sick. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
you need to, to see other people and to kind of interact and even to hug and to shake hands and, all those normal things that we used to do. It's difficult to imagine how interacting like this will be normal.
Well, yeah, I think it's a very fair observation, and I would be very careful when I said there will be changes to leave you with the impression that we're going to change so much that what we knew before will become history. I think we're going to shake hands again. I think we're going to hug, and I think Fareed Zakaria, who's on CNN on Sundays, had an editorial about I'd say about 5 6 weeks ago, where he said human beings like to intermingle. And I believe that. I mean, I know you, and I know the type of personality you are, but I also know this career I had would not have been possible doing it by virtual on screen.
Well, it didn't
There's
exist. Let's
even if it would have existed, I don't think I had the personality to grow in that kind of atmosphere. I can do a conference.
yeah,
Yes, 2 days ago I did one. There were 5,000 people online, so I really felt good about it and everything. But the fact of the matter is, I didn't see any faces except for about 5 or 6 people who were on the screen, and of course I took questions from the person who was interviewing me, and we were both big on the screen, so I didn't actually see anybody. And then I got about 10 questions that came from the audience. Again, I didn't hear the questions.
yeah,
They were actually sent in to the moderator. I would have difficulty, and also in my teaching, to not see the eyes and to not see the reaction. And I had a type of career, George, that I summarized my career in three big periods. I was an educator. I was a teacher, high school teacher in Park X, by the way. Um, and in Montreal North. Secondly, I went into politics, and I did politics at different levels. I was an organizer. I was a director of the Liberal Party. I then helped create Alliance Quebec, which was an English rights group. I then worked with the Commissioner of Official Languages, doing relationships with the French and English speaking communities of Quebec. And then I went into business, and I ran an ad agency, and developed a consulting management reputation group, or excuse me, a reputation management group. Um, and then I went on to do some diplomacy in New York on the behalf of the Quebec government. And then I came back and I did philanthropy for the University of Montreal. Now, these are very people oriented occupations. There's just no way you can do this by having a CV sent to somebody. People got to see how you act. They got to see your judgment. When you're in a meeting right now with 10 or 12 people, you speak when you're asked to speak. But if you interrupt other people, it becomes annoying. I mean, right now we're planning our Christmas dinner, my wife and I and my daughters who live in Vancouver. Now, clearly, we're going to do it. We're going to do it with a screen.
yeah.
But as one of my sisters was telling me, she says, I was thinking of doing that with my own kids, but she says, I get annoyed by the fact that we can't talk over each other, which is what we would do over the regular dinner. And when somebody's telling a story, we want to interact in the telling of the story, and sometimes we get into the habit that you let somebody's talking, so you said let them finish, and then we'll speak afterwards. Well, Christmas dinner is not a formal occasion.
No,
It's a
exactly.
family occasion. It's friends and everything. In business, you can have to be respectful, but I remember going through meetings that sometimes they were difficult, but we would be able to walk into the corridor, and on the way out, and I'd say, look, I felt you were a bit uncomfortable with what was said. And the person would say, yeah, I think so. I think the person didn't respect me. I said, well, look, let's take it easy. Let's go grab a coffee.
No,
Well, we can't do that anymore.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
So I think human beings like to intermingle, and I think that will come back. The only thing that's different is that now we know we can do things differently, and as a result, we have options in the way we're going to do things.
Yeah. Let's get started. There's a lot of things I want to talk to you about, and again, I'm super excited that you're on. I mean, when I was thinking about creating this podcast and creating a platform through which people that work behind the scenes of not only politics but of any industry or any field could be put to the forefront and showcased because of the contribution they make to Quebec society. One of the first images I got in my head was yours. I'm like, this is the example of the person that would be ideal for this podcast. I mean, you are the very definition of what the backstage means, right? In politics, I mean, like you said, you've been involved with the Quebec Liberal Party since the late 70s. You climbed the ranks, you became the director, you played a prominent role in advising almost all the Liberal Party leaders since Claude Ryan. You've held senior positions, such as chief of staff to most of these premiers. Like you said, you've represented Quebec as its as its delegate general in New York. You're often called upon for political commentary to various media. You're an author. I have your book. It's an excellent book, which we're going to talk about. And of course, your favorite thing of all, as you like to say, is your passion for teaching. I mean, there's a lot of things in that, and I'm sure I'm leaving a lot of things behind. But it's just to illustrate to the people watching or listening, the incredible career that you've had behind the scenes of Quebec politics. I mean, do you ever take a moment to look back and wonder, geez, man, what a career I've had?
Well, you're very kind. Obviously, I've done the things I wanted to do, so I'm not sad and regretful. In fact, I've done basically this what I really wanted to do. Teaching remains probably the most significant. The joke I say is that teaching paid me less than any other job, but it's the one that made me richer than any other job, because you're able to make a difference in the life of a person. And today, what makes me happy on Facebook and on Twitter is when I have former students who are now, of course, nearing their retirement, tell me about their lives and tell me how they're doing. And some of them are unfortunately have to battle an illness, and they inform me that they beat cancer, and you say to yourself, well, look, I remember this young lady or this young man when they were 15 and 16 years old, and now they're parents, and they had a life-threatening disease, and they're coming out of it, and they're remembering me as a teacher, and and happy that they're reconnecting with me. So that's been the most rewarding job. Politics is making a difference in society as a whole, as opposed to in the case of one individual, and that also was very, very rewarding. I think I worked with good people. Even those who are in the opposition were people who I think did politics for the right reasons, and I respected them. And I'm still friends with people from all political parties. But it was an engagement to try to make a difference in society and the community as a whole. And then the third one in business, I went into business. It was an established company, so I didn't do it to become rich. I was well paid. I don't complain, but I asked for a little bit of freedom. And one of the freedom I asked the owners of the company was that I be able to accept to do media work and sometimes to express my political opinion. I am a federalist. I believe in progressive politics, and I'm also a liberal in my affiliation. And I told the owners of the company, I said, look, I don't want to end up having to deny who I am. And they said, no problem. You can go and defend and express your point of view. We can live with that. Which means to say that some clients may not have liked it, But I established a relationship with my clients that made it possible for me to do it. So overall, I've had the career I wanted to have, um, and I'm very grateful that I've had good health along the way, and so I've been able to do it. Now I'm past the retirement. The mandatory, or at least I should say, the retirement age of 65, but I'm still active because I believe that retirement will come probably in the other world, and so as long as I'm healthy and I feel good, and I look at young people like you, George, and if ever I can be either helpful in advice, either I can be encouraging in my example and what I do things, I feel good about that. So retirement for me is not something that I'm aiming for. I will do less. Yes, I you talked about books. I did 2 books on U.S. politics. I contributed. I did my own biography in politics. I worked as a ghostwriter in on the life of Mr. Saputo, Lino Saputo, for the cheese conglomerate. And I've got another couple of book plans in my mind, at least one more, and I keep writing on U.S. politics. So I feel I do a variety of things. I don't like to be caught up doing only one thing, and but I have to be inspired by what I do. And so I was very happy to accept your invitation for the podcast because, in my view, this is the new technology. This is basically we're having a conversation. We're not having an interview.
Exactly.
And I think there's not too many forums in the past that was able to do that. I think you're in a process, you and other people who do podcasts, bringing the virtual world a step ahead than what we perhaps had before the virtual world, where we were only interviewing to get a news story and pushing to get a front page admission of sorts.
You speak about inspiration. I just want to go back to how this whole political thing started for you. I mean, what was that moment for you where the switch goes off and you know that this is where you belong? Like the political spheres, like this is where you want to go. This is where your interest is.
I think my parents talked politics, but they were not involved. So I can't say because of my parents. I can say that political shows and political leaders were on television when I was growing up, and therefore their names were like familiar names. And when there was an election, my father owned a shoemaker shop, and people would come to get their shoes fixed, to get their shoes shined, and the discussion on what's happening in politics was something I heard, and that was an interest. But it's not enough to say that it's because of that. Every young person between the ages of 12 and 15 may have probably experienced something like that. I would say the Cuban Missile Crisis got us, mobilized the schools. The teachers talked about it, and then about a year later, John F. Kennedy got assassinated. And I remember where I was that day. I remember what I did the rest of that day, and I remember what I did that weekend, as if it happened just about 2 weeks ago. And then so that I think was probably a moment. But there was a public speaking contest in my high school graduating year, of which I participated and won the school competition, won the regional competition, and came in third in the provincial competition. So I was interested in talking about politics in those speeches. So when you put it all together, it led me to study political science. And in 1968, when Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of John Kennedy, decided to run for the presidency, I was very much excited by that, and I followed it. And of course, when he was assassinated a few months later, I was an adult, but I cried like a child. It hurt, and of course, Martin Luther King was a leader at the time who inspired me a lot. And he died just 2 months before, so I would say it started there. And then, of course, in Quebec, there was the debates on language and the Constitution that came up later in the years. But if you had to ask me uh, how did you get excited in politics, I would say probably U.S. politics was more what got me going. But I ended up obviously being very active in Canadian and Quebec politics. But it started essentially in the '60s, a mix of public speaking contests, the Kennedy years. These were things that, if you would have asked me in 1969, would you ever do politics? I would have answered yes. I don't know when, I don't know how, but I will do it someday.
Yeah.
And ended up doing it about around 1978 is when I got to start to get involved.
Because you do a fantastic job in your book. In the introductory lines and in the beginning of your book, it's amazing how you you address the context in which you were brought up, right? I mean, the environment that you were brought up in, the fact that you were playing with English-speaking kids, but
Yeah.
also you were very much in tune with what was happening in the French society in general, what was happening, and everything that was boiling up in Quebec around Quebec nationalism, the Révolution tranquille, the Quiet Revolution, like you said, the inspiration around the great American leaders, and in general, just the attachment that your parents kind of guided you to have with Quebec culture. And it's funny because I was reading that in your book, and I was thinking, not much seems to have changed. I mean, how crucial for your engagement in politics was that whole issue around the French language debate? Because you do mention that very often in your book.
Well, it was very central because, first of all, my father's shoemaker shop was in Rosemount in the parish of Saint Marc. And it was a French speaking, we were the only family that didn't have a French name. So my father was born in Italy. My father came here speaking only Italian and learned some French, learned French, and then learned English. And by the time I was born, my father was 40 years old. My grandparents on my father's side had passed away. My grandmother never came to Canada. My grandfather did come, but he would go back and maybe earn a little bit of money because they were not that rich. And then my grandmother passed away, and my grandfather then became a resident of Canada, and he passed away before I was born. My grandparents on my mother's side were English and unilingual English, so we only spoke English when they were present. And when I was shortly after, my first language was English, and my mother insisted that I be bilingual because for her, bilingualism was a sign of intelligence, so far as she was concerned. So she says, "I'm going to speak to him in French." And for about 6 months to a year, she apparently spoke to me only in French. And I don't recall when I learned French, but it was not my first language. English was my first. And since my Italian grandparents had passed away, I was never really exposed to Italian at home. My father had become very Canadian, very Quebecois. So my father would speak to my mother in French. My mother would sometimes respond to him in English, but the bottom line is that the home was French and English, and I went to English school, and so that had a lot to do with all my childhood friends on the street in Rosemount spoke only French. They were not bilingual, but I went to an English school that had a lot of Italian kids and other cultural communities, and so I was mixed. I had a multicultural atmosphere at school. I had English as the major language in school. My language of play or of on the street was French, and so I was mixed with all of this, And when I married, I married a French speaking person, and again, the kids when they were born, they were raised in French, but my wife said, "Wait a minute." The mother of my children, she says, "I want them to be as bilingual as you are, so we have a right under the law to send them to English school." So my girls went to English school. Today I speak to my daughters in English, but they have their partners in life are unilingual. Excuse me, I speak to my daughters in French, but their partners in life are unilingual English. So we go sometimes when I'm alone with them, we'll speak in French, and when the partners are in the room, we speak in English. So I've been really, I've been just exposed to the variety of languages, and that's influenced me a lot in the choices I made and in the causes that inspired me in politics.
I mean, John, how is it possible? Because your involvement in politics also started around, this whole issue with French and the French language debate,
Yeah.
and there was this mounting, um, uh, the mounting fever of the independence in the late 70s and 80s, and that's when you kind of came into the game. How is it possible that after all these decades, we still haven't found like a plausible solution to this? I mean, how have we not been able to figure this one out? I mean, it
Well,
keeps coming
it's
back, and even recently now. I mean,
yeah.
federal MP that that came out in one of her committees and said some stuff. They're legislating in Ottawa, in Quebec. We're trying to amend French language bills. How is it possible that we're still in this?
Well, in some ways, the reality is the following. We have in North America basically three languages that are spoken. You have Spanish, you have English, and you have French. French is the language that's the least spoken of those three because the concentration of the French language is in Quebec and some parts of the rest of Canada, but it's very much a minority language in the rest of Canada, and a lot of French Canadian. French Canadian people in other provinces have actually lost their language, and there were legislation in the course of history that did nothing to really improve their attachment to the French language. There were bills that were passed in Ontario. There were bills that were passed in Manitoba that did not respect French language rights. So it's quite an achievement that French is still spoken in other parts of Canada. Quebec, of course, for many, many years had the highest birth rate in the country, and that highest birth rate started to go in the other direction to the lowest birth rate in the country in the 1960s. And there were a lot of studies that were made that showed that immigrants coming to Quebec were integrating into the English community, and the French-speaking community were not having the same high number of children. And there were studies that said that the French language is going to lose its presence even in Quebec, and that you needed language legislation to make sure that immigrants would go to French school, would learn the French, and that businesses would operate in French, and that we would be able to hire somebody where French was the language of work. And if you needed to have a second language, well, the job had to dictate it. And so there was a need for language laws. The first big crisis we had, and it was in the 1960s with the St. Leonard school crisis, where a lot of Italian parents had sent their kids to English school, and the nationalist movement of the day wanted to prevent that from happening. So it became quite problematic. And in the 1970s, we were exposed to language laws. Bill 22, which made French the official language of Quebec, done by liberals, by the way, Robert Bourassa. And then Bill 101, which basically made provisions for French in the workplace, and made sure that English, that French was the predominant language in the province. And to use another word as opposed to official language, it was to be the common language. And some of the nationalists who pushed for French also pushed for Quebec being independent. If Quebec has all the powers, then we're going to have a better control on our future. Not every nationalist felt like that. There were some nationalists who worked with Mr. Bourassa, who believed that we can be part of Canada, but we can make sure that French remains protected and that we promote French. And so I came into politics when there was a nationalist movement that wanted to separate Quebec from Canada, and there was a nationalist component that wanted to stay within Canada, but believed that we needed to do things to protect the French language. So I came into politics during those periods. So I lived through referendum 1980, where René Lévesque of the PQ was now in office, and he asked for a mandate to separate from the rest of Canada. Then there was another referendum in 1992, which had a constitutional deal offered to Quebec under the Charlottetown Accord. And then there was the 1995 referendum, which nearly ended up 50-50. And so those issues have never really completely been resolved and completely disappeared. And I don't think they will be even 20, 30 years from now, when I won't be around to answer your questions. And I don't think it's abnormal. I think the key thing is to find solutions, as opposed to try to think that we can make the issues go away. Quebec, the French language will be a minority language in North America, therefore it will be always under threat. And with the material that we hold in our hands, which is very Anglo culturalized. I think we can expect to still have the issues very much at the center of the debates. So I'm not surprised to see that there's a bit of a language issue starting to raise between the federal government and the Quebec government regarding federally chartered companies. I think they can find a solution. I don't think it's unresolvable, but it's not something that will disappear. The Quebec wanting to separate from Canada is less popular than it was. That I can assure you. The young people are much more international, much more travel wise. They like to go outside Quebec. They want to try new challenges. And Quebec companies have actually done very well looking for markets around the world. So they know that English is very much the language of commerce across the world. But French is a language that is going to be a major language. It is a major language in Africa, and when Africa develops its economy in ways that will be very competitive with the rest of the world, French will become will remain an important language, and so I'm optimistic. I'm not going to predict to you that those issues will go away. They won't. You will always have a part of Quebec that will want to be a separate country, but there will always be an important part of Quebec that believes that Canada is our country and that Quebec helped to develop Canada and therefore want to stay. But all the groups will always, you won't be too many people in Quebec who will tell you, well, we'll adapt if it's only English is spoken. No, we'll fight for the French language. And even though I'm Anglophone by culture, I'm Francophile by attitude. And so I'm very much in favor of protecting the French language. For me, it's not a problem. And it's not contradictory with the fact that my first language is English.
No, but I agree with you, and I appreciate the fact that there were strict measures in Quebec. Because I mean, look at me now. I'm a Bill 101 kid, right? I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
and I'm happy about that. I mean, we speak a language that even the rest of Canada, or in large parts of Canada, don't speak. So I think we have to be grateful for that. But if we go back to 1980, that first referendum, tell me how that was. Tell me the atmosphere around that period. I mean, I wasn't born yet. It was just a year before. But I mean, we look back at this period, and the PQ was at a peak politically. How did they not manage to win that referendum with all that popularity that they had, and to the point where even after they lost that referendum, the Liberals in 1981, the 1981 general election, couldn't even win it. I
Yeah.
mean, so I mean, how does that like? It's such a weird thing for me. You look back at this time and you're like, okay, they lose the referendum, but they managed to still win the general election after that. So what is going on in this period?
Well, it's very much very typical of Quebec because Quebecers are very prudent. There was a saying that in French that said that Quebec will give, ils vont donner tous les coups de pied sauf le dernier. They will kick at the federal government as much as they can, except they won't give that last kick because Quebecers are very sensitive about their financial security, their cultural security. If they are insecure culturally, they will be tempted to take some chances politically speaking. And I think this was what was happening in the 60s and 70s. There was a certain insecurity about language and culture, and the Salvinist movement captured the imagination of young people. These young people today are my age now. They're all baby boomers on the porch, retiring or about to retire. And the young people are millennials today, and they are a lot different. They're used to the French, to the internet. They're used to having friends that speak different languages. Even the religious signs don't bother them as much as it seems to bother the more elderly people, because for them, the elderly people had to fight the dominance of the Catholic religion, and they said, "Well, we're not going to have another religion trying to dominate us." So there's a reaction there. But when you talk to young people, they say, "Look, my best friend's she wears a a scarf. My other friends, she has a kippah." I mean, they don't care about that. It doesn't really bother them that much. So I would say in the 1980 referendum, you had cultural insecurity combined with political affirmation, and the Parti Québécois seemed to capture a lot of the young people's dreams and imagination. Now, they did not have the numbers to win. This was a 60-40 result. Um, and then the federal government and the federalist forces in Quebec had an opportunity to try to find a solution so we wouldn't have to face that again. The Liberals did not run, in my view, a campaign that was inspiring. I was there when we were doing it. I think we had a great team. I think we had a great leader, but he was not inspiring as perhaps Mr. Levesque was, and our constitutional propositions depended very much on the federal government, be willing to do it. And they decided right after the referendum to act with Levesque in office. So Levesque, of course, went along with it because the referendum he had lost it, but the negotiations didn't work out. And finally, when the election came in 1981, the people said, well, we're going to go back with René Levesque, not for separation, but we know he's going to stand up for us.
Yeah, this is
So he got a second term, and that's what happened, and this result was 60-40. You'll say, well, in 1995, it was like 51-49. You're right, but that's because there had been an attempt to solve the problem after 81 called the Meech-Lake Accord, and that failed. And Quebecers, I think, were really upset, and they said, look, unless we put our fist on the table, the rest of the country will never listen. And remember, our referendum questions in both 1980 and in 1995 never, and I make the emphasis on never, promoted outright separation. They asked for mandates to negotiate a new arrangement with the rest of the Canada and have the second referendum approve it. This is a lot different from Brexit,
right.
where basically you are asking to leave,
Interrupt.
and nobody had a second chance to adopt through a referendum. So Brexit works in the next month or so, whereby there's no deal with the rest of Europe. Britain will be on its own. That we never went that way. We always had sort of like a safety provision, and as a result, I'm not surprised. But it's clear that in 1980 the result was a lot stronger for federalism, and the Federalists missed an opportunity in the years that followed to solve the problem. Where the only issue we would be talking about today would not be the Constitution. We'd only be talking about language. Language will always be there.
Yeah.
As an issue.
The period following that first referendum, I mean, for you, it was pretty significant. I mean, it defined for you, a more active role and presence in, what we call the political machine.
Mm-hmm.
You climbed up those ranks in senior staffer positions. How was that for a son of immigrant parents? At a time where I can only assume there weren't that many people from diversity in high office. I mean, how were you and other members from diversity perceived at that point in time? Because I remember in your book, you also talk about in 1985 where you wanted to run as a candidate and you were rejected from a riding because of your name.
Yeah.
It was too foreign for people. I mean, how was that whole reality? I mean, as John Parisella, I mean, it's such an exotic name for people that have been used to whatever the reality was back then to have reached, these positions.
Well, I think what happened in the writing that sort of like believed I would lose the writing because of my name, and therefore they didn't think that it was a good idea. That was the writing of Anjou, my home writing, by the way, and I ended up running in the writing of Mercier, which was a majority French-speaking writing, but there was more cultural communities than there was in Anjou. So I ran there, and that worked, but it had not worked any other writing. I think the reality was that a lot of the cultural communities were not seen as being fully integrated in the reality of French Quebec. Because of my upbringing in Rosemount, had a greater understanding of it, and my French was very fluent, and so I could past like a French Canadian in some places, but my name was an English first name and an Italian second name. So I was actually quite fortunate to be able to play the roles I've played. But I think it's because I also worked at it and also listened a lot and tried to learn. When I was a high school teacher, by the way, I invited René Lévesque. I talk about that in my book. I invited René Lévesque because I wanted the students to know that René Lévesque wasn't a traitor. He just had a different point of view about where Quebec should go, and he wanted to make Quebec a separate or an independent country, but one that would still have links with the rest of the country. But we would be Québécois and not Canadiens. And so I said, I want my students to be exposed to that. I didn't want to be converted because I wasn't converted. I mean, Levesque, I had a conversation with him that lasted about an hour before, and I was very clear with him. I said, I'm not a sovereignist, Mr. Levesque, but I think my students need to be exposed to somebody like you, who I think is a very reasonable, honest person, and I want them to grow up making the choice based on facts, not based on prejudice. And he was very, very grateful, and he said, "Look, I have no problems with that." And he was very good in the meeting. He charmed everybody so much that at the end of the hour so meeting, people gave him a standing ovation. But he didn't convert anybody, but he just made people realize that he wasn't an enemy, that he wasn't some kind of a dangerous person. So I've always worked in that direction. And today I'm part of a group that's promoting the French language with Pauline Marois, who's from a different political family than me. So my attitude is to be involved, to be, there's a saying that says you got two ears and one mouth. You should listen twice before you speak. And excuse me. And I try to work in ways that I try to look at what unites us more than what divides us, and I think the French language can be a uniting factor. On the other hand, you have to respect the minority rights as well. And the English speaking community has been here for years, has developed institutions. And now, on top of that, there is probably the most bilingual group in all of Quebec. So there's ways we can work together and rather than work apart. On the question of the independence of Quebec, I still believe Canada is a better solution for Quebec, and I think Quebec can influence Canada in directions that give them additional powers. I mean, we have more powers in immigration than the rest of the country. We have a caisse de dépôt. The rest of the country doesn't have a caisse de dépôt. We have an international profile that no other province has around the world. We're in something like 18 nations with 33 offices. No province comes anywhere close to that. So there are things we can do that are different, and we can do it within Canada. And my goal has been to try to convince people of that we can find solutions within Canada, but we have to be respectful of a different point of view and learn what the other point of view is about.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're mentioning that whole story with René Lévesque because, as you know, I worked over 11 years in Laurier Dorion, and before he left the Liberal Party to create the PQ, he was elected in that area,
Yeah.
in riding in Laurier. And it's funny because, I've been campaigning there since 2007, and very often I've knocked on doors where, obviously older people have answered, people that were there that had elected him under the Liberal banner and
Yeah,
are still
sure.
living in Park X. And they would tell me all these stories about how, amazing he was, and how they had supported him when he was a Liberal and all that stuff. And how he was a very charming personality. And
Yeah, he was very, very likable. I mean, he was a person who had a good sense of. He was a listener. That's one thing about Levesque. He didn't, and he was very respectful of a different point of view. And he was born and raised in I guess in Gaspésie in the village of New Carlisle, where there was a sizable Anglophone population, and he played with English kids when his English, by the way, was actually without an accent and actually more fluent than Robert Bourassa's was, and so Mr. Levesque was a person who had no problem switching to English, but he was very conscious about changing the Canadian Federation to protect the French language and to protect Quebec's interests. And when he felt that we couldn't do it, that's when he made the shift towards independence. But he was not a hardline independentist. And in the years that when he left politics, he actually accepted Brian Mulroney's efforts to try to he called it le beau risque, the good risk, to try to see if we could find a solution within Canada. So René Lévesque was not a hardline separatist, and I'm glad I met him. I'm glad I introduced him to my students. I spoke to him a few times while he was premier, but I will always be very respectful of who he was and what he represented. But I didn't share his point of view, especially with respect to Quebec leaving Canada.
You mentioned the Meech Lake and the second referendum and even the Charlottetown Accord and all those things. Tell me a little bit about that period between 1985 and 95. It was such a charged period, in Quebec's political history. I mean, you have Bourassa's French language bill. You had the Oka crisis. A certain reinforcement of Quebec nationalism. Like you said, the failed Meech Lake and Charlottetown Accord. How was it back then to be like right in the middle of these things at that time, and to be running the premier's government, his cabinet? I mean,
well, it was it was exciting, stressful, a lot of uncertainty. There was polarization. It was not an easy time. I think the first big rendezvous with history was the Meech Lake Accord. I think when Bourassa was able to negotiate with Mr. Mulroney and the other premiers the Meech Lake Accord, we all felt that we had finally gotten over the referendum of 1980 and that we were going in the right direction. Mr. Bourassa in 1988 had also protected the French language after a Supreme Court ruling allowing for bilingual signs, and he put a notwithstanding clause because he felt the population wasn't ready and he wanted to make sure that French would be predominant, but he didn't want to prohibit another language, but he couldn't do that unless he put a notwithstanding clause. So 4.5 years later, he removed the notwithstanding clause and he allowed English and other languages provided French was everywhere and provided French was more predominant. So that was the second big challenge he had, the language issue on that. The third one was Oka. Oka is something that I think is a reflection of our insensitivity to what First Nations have faced, and we have all kinds of studies right now that indicate that we still have ways to go in understanding, but it was clear that it was an issue that revolved around a decision by municipality to develop what the First Nation, the Mohawk First Nation, considered to be sacred lands, and there was not a sensitivity to the First Nations, and as a result, there was barricades, and the barricades extended themselves to cover areas outside Montreal. One was the Mercier Bridge, and the other one was in the Oka region. So that was a third major crisis. And so now comes or at least Meech was positive, but it didn't pass the test. It needed 3 years to be approved, ratified, and it failed on the very, very last day. And so that got a lot of people upset, and a lot of people were in the streets that weekend, and people were hoping Bourassa would become a separatist, but Bourassa was not a separatist, and so he tried to work a deal that would build from the failure, but build towards something that would be positive, and that's what led to the Charlottetown Accord. But that was rejected by Quebecers who didn't feel it went far enough, and by the rest of the country, where some provinces were in favor, others were not. Some felt it went too far, others felt it didn't do the thing, and I think there was a lot of unpopularity with the Mulroney government at the time, and I think that didn't help. And so that was where I was the Premier's Chief of Staff throughout all that period, and so it was stressful. It was a lot of uncertainty, and there was a lot of, but there was a lot of excitement. And then came the referendum of 1995, and and the PQ had just won office, and they had won government, and so they decided to do a referendum in year one, and we had to get ready, but we didn't have the wind in our sails, and we couldn't talk about changing Canada when we had failed after 1980, and we had failed with Meech Lake, and we had failed with Charlottetown. So we didn't have a very inspirational message. Our only message was say no to separatism. Well, people said, wait a minute now, that's not. There's more to our problems than saying no to separatism, and we want a yes to change. And you failed 3 times. Trudeau repatriating the Constitution, and after the referendum, Meech Lake succeeding at being negotiated and then rejected when it came to ratifying it, and people who had changed their minds. Charlottetown being rejected overall. So we weren't very convincing.
In your book, John, you mentioned that had there not been a Meech Lake, and had we only had the Charlottetown Accord, things may have turned out differently for Quebec and Canada.
Well, probably the reason is very simple. The resentment that people had, a lot of people in Quebec felt that Meech Lake was more generous than Charlottetown. And to some extent, I can understand that point of view. But when you really look at the two bills or the two accords, you realize that the accord, the big difference was that Charlottetown was giving something to other parts of the country, including the First Nations. Charlottetown, Meech was just for Quebec, because Quebec was upset. But we basically saved everything Quebec was getting, plus we made a few more gains, and other parts of the country were making more gains. If the failure of the Meech Lake Accord had not poisoned the political atmosphere, you're right. I would go as far as to say that Charlottetown might have been the solution. But now nobody talks about going back to Charlottetown because Charlottetown was seen as a failure. But when analysts look at it, especially in the world of in the university world, where you can actually nobody's going to vote. Nobody. You can study things, and with less pressure and less stress, and without the political process in place. You realize that Charlottetown, there was some positive things. It kept most of Charlotte. It kept most of Meech, and gave Quebec some extra guarantees. It also helped the First Nations. It also was giving what Alberta wanted with respect to a reformed Senate. So there was a lot of positive stuff that was done, and of course. For the French language in other provinces as well.
All this thing that led to that second referendum, and I remember the second referendum. I remember because my family's always been involved in the community, in the Greek community, and I remember leaders in the community just working so hard, getting people, mobilizing them. There was so much effort put into that campaign. I don't know if people understood how close it would have been. I remember that night sitting in front of the TV with my parents, just looking at the results coming in, and it was nail biting. I mean, you mentioned the result. I mean, 51-49. I mean, it could not have been closer. And in addition to that, I still remember the remarks that Premier Parisella made with respect to the immigrants and to the rich that had pretty much caused this referendum to be lost, and that had like this deep impact, especially obviously my parents, who at that point, I mean, they weren't even considering themselves immigrant anymore. After 30 years or whatever, you're pretty much more Quebecer than you are from wherever you come from. And I've spoken to so many people that even separatists that took that wrong. They're like, what is going on over here? That's not right. It kind of it, it implanted itself kind of in my memory about what the PQ was, right? Until much later on when I started doing politics, I just thought the PQ is the enemy of the immigrants.
Yeah. Well, I think they certainly, when the sovereignist movement came into being and the PQ got formed, it's clear that the cultural communities and the Anglophone community felt under siege or felt threatened. And so there were very, very few non-Francophones who were in the PQ movement. There were a few, few, but very few, and they were not terribly influential. So when the time came to that second referendum, a lot of people were felt again in the Anglo community and in the cultural communities threatened by the fact that sovereignty could take place. And when the vote was so close, and Mr. Parisot made those unfortunate remarks this night of, a lot of people felt rejected, and and I think that transformed Quebec to a large extent. First of all, we have not done a referendum since, and secondly, the PQ, I think, regrets that moment deeply. Mr. Parisot, I think, regretted it as well and resigned not long after. And I think Quebecers today are much more sensitive to those things, and I think we're at a point right now where we're looking in ways that we can do things together much more than doing things apart. But back then, it was more polarized. As much as we say U.S. politics was polarized, is in this last election with Trump versus Biden, the Democrats versus the Republicans, I could say that the most polarized period that I felt in Quebec in my lifetime, clearly. The 60s were, the 70s were polarizing, but at the same time, you could sense that we were looking for a solution to the problems. In 1995, we got an impression that maybe we're going to stop talking to each other, and that wasn't good. And I think we've come away from that. It's been 25 years now, and I think that we're away from that, and that's good.
We're going to be closing it up, but before we do, because you mentioned about the way that you did politics and how you've always been open to at least listening to the other side, even though you don't necessarily agree with the positions. And in general, you're just known for for a political service and a career that is nearly devoid of partisan combativeness and animosity. You've been known for your desire to see Quebec progress irrespective of partisanship, and I think it's definitely the reason you've created and maintained, like you said, all these friendships, with different people across party lines. Do you think, in your opinion, this is a more effective way of doing politics?
I would give you as a short answer, yes. I believe that um, we're talking a lot about the polarization now that Trump's leaving, and the Republicans refuse to, not many anyway, recognize Biden. I believe that the solution to America will be that they work together. And I think the solution to Quebec and Canada is that we find ways that we can work together. It doesn't mean that we have to agree with each other. It doesn't mean that we are going to convert the other side, that there will only going to be one party. That would be worse. It would be like a dictatorship. There will always be different parties, but there are ways of finding solutions. And I believe dialogue, listening, and trying to find areas where we can compromise is a step forward. But always done with two words in mind: respect and civility. In other words, respect for what the other person says, and civility in doing it by debate, by process, by listening, by providing amendments. I mean, these are the things, in my view, that have served me. I'm very proud of being a Quebecer, but I'm also very proud of being a Canadian. And I think many countries in the world would have lived through our issues, probably would have ended up fighting it in the streets with guns. And we were able to do it with ballots, not bullets. We were able to do it through a referendum, not civil war. And I still am an optimist for the future. And I look at the young millennials, both French, in the French community, because I teach in the French community, but I also know the English speaking community, work with people who've graduated from the English speaking community. I think we've got a generation that's inspirational, a generation that's looking for solutions, a generation that's fundamentally civil and respectful. And I'm an optimist, and I would go as far, and maybe that's the best way of closing. I'm not only an optimist, but I'm confident that we'll find solutions much more than we'll find division, discord, and confrontation.
Beautiful. I love it. Great way to end it. John, I've taken a lot of your time. Again,
Pleasure.
I want to thank you, and I really, really do appreciate the time that you took. Hopefully soon, we'll get to see each other again.
Yeah, we'll grab a long coffee or a long lunch, but it'll be great to see you again. And it was nice seeing you, and you're terrific. You did a good job, and you made me feel very comfortable. It was an honor to be with you.
I appreciate it, John.
Happy holidays to you.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye.